Okay, lovely. Welcome to the side session for the UNR BHR session on workplace sexual harassment, the role of businesses in furthering feminist justice. This session is being held by One Future Collective. Could we have the next slide? To introduce ourselves, One Future Collective exists to advance social justice by catalyzing people power and just institutions. We're a feminist social purpose organization with a vision of a world built on social justice, led by communities of care. To introduce our speakers for today, we have Asha Kochar, and who's the lead of our Healing and Justice vertical, and we have myself, Anmita Walia. I'm a senior program manager with One Future Collective. We were also going to have Vandita Morarka, the founder of our organization, but they were unable to make it due to ill health today. So before we start our session, we wanted to ask all of you, what is your idea of justice? You can share words, images, metaphors, colors, or you can even share words in English or your native languages as well. But what is your idea of justice? I know it's a little daunting to be the first person to share, but if you would like, you could just raise your hand and share. Or go ahead. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to everyone who's just joining. We're just asking everyone what their idea of justice is before we begin the session for today. What are maybe some words or images that come to mind when you think of the word justice?
Fairness.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. Would anyone else like to share?
I imagine about the pictures of court.
Court.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, I think we can go ahead with the presentation, but if you would like to share more ideas, we have a flip chart here where you can also document some of your ideas. Yes, thank you for the session today. In the first half of the session, we will be talking a little bit about our conceptual framework of feminist justice, and then we'll be going into an interactive section where we'll be asking you some questions and we'll have a discussion as well. Before we go ahead, I also want to mention that the session is being recorded and we are also taking photographs which will be posted on social media. So I hope we have everyone's consent for that. So number one, we'll be talking about why we conducted this study out. And for context, today we'll be talking about a conceptual framework for feminist justice, which is based on a research study that was conducted by Vandita Morarka during their master's thesis. So the reason we carried out the study is because last year, that is 2023, marked 10 years since the Prevention of Sexual Harassment at the Workplace Act was enacted in India. Number one, to mandate redressal mechanisms for workplace sexual harassment. And number two, to prevent sexual harassment from taking place by building safer workplaces to begin with. This was enacted 16 years after the first Supreme Court mandated laws were passed after the guidelines of Vishaka Guidelines of 1997. Now, over the last 10 years, the POSH law has been quite helpful in bringing about change while addressing sexual harassment and violence at the workplace, but it does have significant deficiencies. So due to this, we began a research study that sought to examine the implementation as well as the effectiveness of the Prevention of Sexual Harassment law in India. This research study was, again, as I mentioned, conducted by Vandita Morarka. And we would also like to thank the Institute of Developmental Studies and Chevening for their support throughout the process. Could we have the next slide? Now, why did we take this idea of feminist justice? All of us probably over here have different ideas of justice. Someone mentioned that they think of courts when they think of justice. Someone mentioned fairness. In this particular study, we wanted to subscribe to the idea of feminist justice because number one, we identified that traditional theories of justice as well as the law tend to be lacking in the way that they think of justice. Because they either ignore gender or when they think of gender, they sort of situate masculinity as the standard inevitably. Secondly, they also subscribe to individual-centric ideas of justice where the individual perpetrator is punished for the harm that they have caused. Thirdly, they also have universalist ideas of justice, where justice is seen as universal across all cases a lot of times, which can be quite welcome to the session, which can be quite difficult to navigate, given that each case is quite context specific. And lastly, this idea of justice is also because when we think of punishment and control, which we call carcerality or carceral logics, punishment and control may lead to immediate redressal, but it does not always meet the needs of survivors who are undergoing harm. And so therefore, we wanted to conceptualize and propose this idea of feminist justice for various reasons. Number one is because the nature of patriarchy itself is constantly changing on institutional, on interpersonal, on individual and ideological levels. Number two, because we want to hold space for pluralities and diversities and diverse contexts within which sexual harassment takes place, rather than subscribe to a universal idea of justice. Number three, to question the hegemony of knowledge systems that view the world through a gendered hierarchy. And number four, to articulate alternative ways to address gendered issues without simply reversing or reinforcing traditional hierarchical dichotomies of male-female, because there's a spectrum of gender that currently exists. Could we have the next slide? So how did we conduct this study? We conducted this study with the primary question, if and how can a feminist justice approach provide a pathway to addressing sexual harassment at formal urban workplaces in India? Now, we didn't want to have a prescriptive answer for this, and we identified that this is something that we're still exploring. But through our study, we wanted to examine how this feminist justice framework that we'll be proposing to you can be applied in India in the context of formal urban workplaces. For this, we collected primary and secondary data, including data from 10 anti-sexual harassment practitioners, as well as secondary data from literature on this topic. Can we have the next slide? And through our primary and secondary data, we proposed a conceptual framework called Tapestry of Feminist Justice. Now, our Tapestry of Feminist Justice is basically how we conceptualize feminist justice in the context of violence and workplace harassment. This tapestry has 5 threads. Number one is the ethics of care. When we look at feminist literature, feminist literature often critiques justice because the idea of justice is often related to rights and rules that are specifically focused on the public sphere or the political sphere. But feminists argue that we also need to incorporate the idea of care. The idea of care is often relegated to the private sphere or the personal sphere. So through this ethics of care thread, we want to basically talk about how justice without care is not truly justice. And we want to incorporate this idea of care within justice, where we focus not just on rights and rules, but also how we can provide care to survivors in their communities. Number two, just means and ends. Now, when we look at the process of, from the process of filing a complaint for sexual harassment to the process of seeking redressal, the process can be quite re-victimizing and quite traumatizing for survivors who seek justice. And so we wanted to propose this idea of just means and ends, where we're not just looking at substantive justice, which is equitable outcomes, but also procedural justice, which is that there's fairness, as you mentioned, fairness in the way that procedures are being conducted, that our processes are person-centered, that our practices are trauma-informed. Then we look at transformation of systems. Transformation of systems basically is because, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of our ideas of justice are individual-centric, where we just punish the person who has perpetrated harm. But we don't address the systemic enablement of that person's actions. The person's actions are situated within a specific context, and the system is enabling the kind of violence and sustaining that violence over time. And so we want to not just look at individual change, but transformation across a systemic level by dismantling structural oppression. So this is a two-pronged approach of we're looking at individual change, but also at systemic level change. Then we have power-critical intersectional accountability. This was at the heart of what all of the participants said, where they spoke about how we need an intersectional approach when we talk about justice. This can be carried out, they gave examples for this as well, for example, by having power audits and looking at where power lies when we're looking at the approach of preventing and redressing sexual harassment. Is the power lying with the company? Is it lying with the perpetrator or the survivor? And how does that dynamic affect the way that justice is being served? We also talk about intersectional accountability by placing lived experience, the value of lived experience when we look at decision making in the context of justice. This is often not considered when we talk about justice. And lastly, in the context of India, a lot of the participants spoke about how caste, disability, sexuality, and various spectrum of gender identities come into play and how these are all interrelated. And across the world as well, it would be helpful to think about how the intersections of all of these identities play a role in the way that violence occurs and justice is served. Lastly, we spoke of healing and restoration because we believe, again, that without healing and restoration, we cannot have justice. Because a lot of times, as I mentioned, the process of seeking justice, of even speaking up about the violence that has occurred, can be quite re-traumatizing for survivors. And therefore, we wanted to focus on how we're meeting the needs of survivors, not just through punishment or through immediate redressal, but also long-term healing and restoration for the survivor and their communities. So that is the conceptual framework of feminist justice that we proposed from the primary and secondary data that we have collected. Can you have the second slide? So now what we did was we applied this framework of feminist justice to the current POSH law, which is the Prevention of Sexual Harassment law, and its implementation in India. And we saw various findings to that. We've identified successes of the law, gaps within the law, barriers in the law, as well as strategic opportunities for how the implementation of this law can be improved. So when we speak of our successes, number one is institutional protections. This is a success because until 10 years ago, there wasn't any institutional protection that was mandated by law. So that was a huge change for our country. Healing and restoration options. So to give you some context, the Prevention of Sexual Harassment law in India provides healing and restoration options such as conciliation, which is when the redressal does not occur by punishing the perpetrator, but through mediation between the perpetrator and the survivor, so that they can come they can discuss and mutually come at a way to address the harm that has been caused. It also doesn't only focus on punishment, but also incorporates rehabilitative measures for perpetrators. And lastly, it also provides for mental health support for survivors as well. So it does have healing and restoration options, which we identified as a success for the law. Thirdly, increased awareness. Because the law has been mandated by the government, due to this, there has been increased awareness within workplaces. There are a lot of awareness, workshops that are happening, courses that are happening. Also, awareness through social media has been a huge success for the law as well. Could we have the next slide? We've also identified some gaps for the law. Number one is that the idea of intersectionality seems to be missing from the law. So for context, the law focuses on women as survivors or as victims of sexual harassment, and it sees men as perpetrators. But it doesn't acknowledge that men perhaps can also be survivors of violence. And there are people who are non-binary and people with diverse identities who can also be survivors or perpetrators of sexual violence. Also, if you look at feminist movements in general, there seems to be a missing lens of intersectionality. So that was a huge gap that we identified within the law. Then there was also limited employer accountability and liability. Because without this, employers don't feel like they are mandated to address the case of sexual harassment in a just manner. Number three, insufficient implementation of the law, or perhaps even inadequate implementation of the law if it is being implemented. So for context, the complaint committees that exist in India, what ends up happening is that either they are under-resourced or they're underfunded, due to which they're unable to actually sustain the process of providing justice to survivors. Even if there is, even if these committees do exist, there's corruption and often unethical practices that take place, due to which there's insufficient or inadequate implementation of the law. Number four, role of the POSH industry. Now, the POSH industry, by this we mean that because the Prevention of Sexual Harassment law was mandated, this has led to an unregulated growth of POSH practitioners and people who try to create awareness about the law and such. But while this is great, the awareness aspect of this is great, the reason we have identified this as a gap is because a lot of times the way that this awareness is being carried out often is for the benefit of the organization and not as much for the benefit of survivors themselves. So the priorities of the POSH industry and the POSH practitioners sometimes ends up getting lost in that maze of serving their organizational needs. So we identify this as a gap of applying the law and implementing the law. Number 5, lacking ecosystems of support. So as we mentioned, the context of survivors and perpetrators and their communities is a big part in whether justice is served and how justice is served. When we think of ecosystems of support, we're referring to the police, people at the workplace, the employers, the team of the survivor and the perpetrator, the families of the survivor and the perpetrator, the communities, the friends. And what we've noticed is that a lot of times, because of stigma and because of unethical practices, there's a lack of ecosystem support that survivors are able to get, due to which they may not even speak of the harm that has been caused. Or if they do speak of it, they are the ones who end up having to be re-traumatized or having to face, consequences for speaking up. For example, a lot of times, survivors may face retaliation from the workplace for speaking up about the harm that has been caused. So without ecosystems of support, we can bring about change on an individual level, but we need to change ecosystems of support too and make them more trauma-informed and supportive to be able to really serve justice. Number 6, misinformation and co-option of public discourse. By this, we're referring to a lot of this happens on social media, where there's misinformation about sexual harassment, and over time, when we think about feminist narratives on harassment and violence as well, a lot of these public discourse and narratives have been co-opted and been used in a way to spread disinformation or misinformation. So you may have noticed sometimes that feminism is often equated with anti-men narratives, right? If you actually go to see, feminism is not about being anti-men, but because public discourse has co-opted this sort of language, what ends up happening is that it undermines the idea of feminist justice, because feminist justice is then viewed as anti-men or is then viewed as harmful to certain communities. So these are some of the gaps that we've identified within the law, within India, but this can also be applicable across the globe. Can we have the next slide? Then we've also identified certain barriers when it comes to the implementation of the sexual harassment law. Number 1 is corporatization of the anti-sexual harassment work in India. By this we mean that because we focus on formal workplaces and this work has been taken up by corporates. This corporatization means that the accountability of posh practitioners, as I mentioned earlier, is to organizations and not to survivors. And at the end of the day, organizations do have power dynamics within the organization as well. So if there are cases where survivors, there is power dynamic between the perpetrator and the survivor, or the employer and the survivor, the posh practitioner may end up supporting the person with power and not the person who has actually faced the harm. So that is one of the issues with corporatization of the posh anti-sexual harassment work. Secondly, the value of lived experience is often not taken into account when we address the experiences of harm that people experience because of this very corporate nature of addressing anti-sexual harassment at the workplace. And lastly, because this posh law has reduced compliance to a checklist where every organization is like, these are the checklist of things that we have to do or not do in order to be posh compliant or prevention of sexual harassment compliant. What that does is that takes away accountability from public actors, and it also leads to corruption and unethical practices because of corporatization. Number 2 is capitalist and carceral logics with a focus on redressal, legal compliance, and upholding power dynamics. So when we speak of carceral logics, what we're referring to is any sort of activity that's based on the idea of punishment, on the idea of control, on the idea of surveillance. And when we look at traditional justice systems, or when we look at the law, these ideas are often focused on the logic of carcerality and capitalism. For example, when we spoke about corporatization, that is interrelated with the idea of capitalism as well. And so these kind of logics prioritize punishment and compliance over systemic transformation. And that leads to the case of sexual harassment being addressed immediately and sort of being brushed under the rug. But that doesn't lead to larger systemic change. It doesn't lead to prevention. And therefore, we think of carceral and capitalist logics within the framework as a barrier to actually seeking feminist justice under the posh law. Number 3 is popular narratives around feminism and co-option of language. As we mentioned, this is also interrelated with the gap that we identified, where feminism is often interrelated with negative connotations or anti-men narratives. And due to this, the idea of feminism is often undermined, which undermines ultimately the idea of feminist justice too. Lastly, we identified some strategic opportunities for implementing the Posh Law through the lens of feminist justice. Number 1 is implementation of existing legal framework. So here we propose a better implementation of the existing legal framework. How can we make, so for example, in the context of India, one huge issue with implementing the framework is that there's underfunding. So one of the ways we can do this is by open access knowledge, by making open access resources for awareness about POSH, by making open access resources, especially for people who are serving as members of the complaint committee. How can we implement this in a way that is accessible to people? Secondly, how can we think of ways to incorporate healing and restoration for the survivor as well as their communities within the POSH law as well, that is implemented in a way that is implemented more than it is in the current context. So those are some ways where we identified how we can better implement the POSH law. Number 2 is worker voice and organizing. We see organizing as a collective voice as a very helpful way of implementing the prevention of sexual harassment law at the workplace, because it is through perhaps unions or the collective voice of people demanding not just the organization but also the government to implement the law in a more just and caring manner, in a more trauma-informed manner. Therefore, we think of worker voice and organizing as a huge opportunity for implementing it better. Number 3 is leveraging social media and the public narrative. At the end of the day, even though the law is, someone mentioned that they think of courts when they think of the law. But the law and the implementation of the law is not limited to courts, right? It is related to cultural change as well. And therefore, we think of advocacy and social media and changing the public narrative as a huge resource to be able to bring about change, not just within the culture and not just within the way people perceive and address sexual violence and harassment, but also in the way that policies are formed, in the way that the law then perhaps is formed too. And lastly, compliance linked to funding and investments. So in India, there's been a huge growth of POSH committees and POSH compliance that has been occurring because funders and people who are investing in the companies are sort of demanding people to form these committees and comply with the POSH law. And so therefore, we think of this as an opportunity for also better implementing the law and creating better policies within the organization as well. So these are some of the strategic opportunities that we identified as a part of the study that was conducted. So as you can see, can we have the framework again? So I would like to take a minute to, again, sit with the framework and think about the framework in the context of the kind of, successes, gaps, barriers, as well as the opportunities that we've just identified. And I would also like you to think about this in the context of your countries. Have you seen all of these, threads of feminist justice being applied in your countries? Where do you think are, the successes, the gaps, the barriers, and the opportunities in your countries as well? I'll also take a moment now to hold space for everyone to reflect a little bit on this feminist justice tapestry. If anyone has any questions as well, or if you joined a little bit late, you can feel free to ask questions. We'll take a minute for that. Of course. So to give you some context for everyone who joined late, we were basically talking about a conceptual framework for feminist justice. And this is a framework that we have proposed after having interviews with 10 prevention of sexual harassment practitioners in India, as well as secondary data through literature on various issues such as sexual violence, prevention of sexual harassment across the globe as well as in India. And we identify this idea of feminist justice because we feel like the current ideas of justice tend to be, they tend to propagate masculine hegemony, they tend to be individualistic, they do not have an intersectional approach, and they tend to subscribe to the idea of carcerality. which is why we wanted to propose this idea of feminist justice to be able to see how we can implement the prevention of sexual harassment law better in India. And these were the threads that we came up with. And we'll also be here after the session if anyone has any questions on what all of these threads mean. I also want to take a moment to talk about how when we were conceptualizing this framework as well, we don't think of the threads as existing individually or in isolation. We think of these threads having a very dynamic and iterative relation with each other, in the sense that if one thing changes, then the other thing changes too. So for example, if the just means and ends part is focused on, if we have fairer ways of procedures of decision making, then that is likely to change the systems within which these violence cases are also being addressed. So all of these are interrelated with each other, and we don't think of this as any of these existing in isolation. Okay, I'm sensing that we don't have any questions right now, but we can come back at the end of the session. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, Tom McInerney from Loyola University and Stockholm Environment Institute. I'm curious. I think the framework seems plausible, but somebody who works advising organizations on sexual harassment policies and everything, what information do you have? What insights do you have about the effectiveness of these approaches? And is there data? Is there concrete empirical evidence to back it up?
Thank you so much for asking that. So we don't have data on like all of it together, but we do have data for individual threads that currently exist. So for example, when we look at the idea of healing and restoration, if we do a deep dive into what that research has looked like, do you know the idea of restorative justice? The idea of restorative justice, for context, is when people believe that we need to focus not on punishment, but on the idea of, relations and healing as a way of reconciling the harm that has been caused. So when we look at research on, for example, restorative justice, it shows that while restorative justice is a way of, a lot of times survivors do see value in that and their needs are being met, and also it leads to higher compliance for perpetrators to not re-perpetrate harm as well. There are also drawbacks to restorative justice that research has currently identified. So within each of these specific, threads, we have identified research that talks about the drawbacks and the, merits of that as well. So, for example, even when we look at power critical intersectional accountability, if in the context of India, if I can talk about that, we have noticed that within India, when we look at the criminal justice system, there is a disproportionate representation of people from marginalized communities in the criminal justice system, and therefore we do see there has been research on how intersectional ways of approaching justice can be quite beneficial, especially given how diverse experiences of sexual harassment can be for both the survivor and the perpetrator. So that we do have research on specific threads. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Dr. Archana and I represent Change Alliance and India. When you talk about organizing, I just want to understand, especially in context of India and prevention of sexual harassment at workplace, how do you look into organizing? Because the cases are confidential and it is breach of trust and confidentiality the moment you organize and you talk about it in public. So how do we look into it? I mean, you're not supposed to reveal the name of the witnesses, complainant and respondent, and any details, any recommendations, or even the punishment or whatever. So how do you look into organizing, and then how do you also ensure that the law is in place and confidentiality is already intact within that? So that is one. Second, you touched upon the intersectionality accountability. So I hope you're looking into not women as a homogeneous category, but the social identity and many other things that play into it as intersectional. So how do you look into all of it together?
Thank you so much for both the questions. I think these are great questions. So number one, we spoke about how worker voice and organizing can be helpful. So when we conceptualized this, as we mentioned, we looked at various levels of how the Posh law and this feminist justice framework can be implemented. It's institutional, on a cultural level, interpersonal level, and individual level. I also want to say that breach of confidentiality is actually a huge issue with the Posh law. So I think that's a great point that you mentioned, that confidentiality is very imperative when we think of applying the law. But when we think of worker voice and organizing, we sort of it more on the level of like a cultural or institutional change as compared to an individual change. So we situated healing and restoration, and also on a community level as well. But worker voice and organizing was more about cultural change within the organization or within the culture as well. One way to do this for individual cases could be that while maintaining, the confidentiality of the survivor and the perpetrator, for example, the HR could have more awareness sessions, or perhaps, within the organization, there could be unions where a collective union is formed. And of course, that this can also be complicated given that the survivor may not want to share something that has taken place with them. But having unions which do not breach the confidentiality of the survivor or the perpetrator, having, the HR involved by initiating awareness campaigns, by initiating, activities for employees of the organization to be able to work towards a more just workplace, can help in not just redressing the harm that has been caused, but also preventing the harm that may be caused in the future. Does that answer your question? Okay, lovely.
It's also within the within the purview of the IC to do these sessions, right? So the HR doesn't necessarily need to step in. A cultural change can be and has to be pushed from the IC itself, because I just want to bring this up because I think a couple of years ago or maybe 3 years ago, the name of the committee itself has changed from Internal Complaints Committee to Internal Committee, to indicate that their job is not just to provide redressal mechanisms or just conduct inquiry when cases come up, but it's also about prevention and prohibition. So even the law in itself has a lot of scope to be implemented in ways that can allow for cultural change. But I think, as Anvita was mentioning, what we have also seen is that there is a huge gap in implementation, and how it's picked up by the organizations for a number of factors that we have already discussed.
Thank you so much. So when we also spoke about worker voice and collective organizing, we were keeping in mind that a lot of times these ICs and also HRs don't actually serve the needs of the survivor. So this is more of a way to resist that sort of power dynamic as well through, unions or cultural change. I also see someone else had a question.
Hi, my name's Lydia. I'm a lawyer in the UK working on sexual violence cases that arise in supply chains. I think the insights you shared today were extremely interesting, especially this intersectionality approach. I think definitely needs to be infused more in legal analysis of cases. Something that we see in a lot of situations is the reality and I'm thinking about workers in a sort of supply chain context, but I think this is also quite prevalent. Victims of or survivors of sexual abuse, there's a huge culture of shame around that, and so many tangible and intangible barriers that face people and prevent them from coming forward. So I'd be interested to know how the framework sort of interacts with that. And then I guess, just more generally about this existing in a supply chain context. We're seeing sexual violence as a feature, in so many different industries and so many different jurisdictions. And I think it's part of, a wider picture of, an exploitation of workers. It's another way in which to do that. So again, if there's any sort of maybe a way to apply your intersectionality sort of analysis to that, that would be really interesting to know as well.
Thank you so much. I think I also have not addressed the second question by you, so I'll address both of these questions together. So when we speak about, focusing on the culture of shame and fear that has been associated with sexual violence, especially for survivors, all of these things are interrelated and we have kept in mind that this needs to be a trauma-informed and survivor-centric approach to feminist justice. So as you asked earlier, that do we think of women as homogeneous? No, definitely not. And even within the study, a lot of participants actually mentioned the intersections of gender with caste, with disability, with religion, with, sexuality as well. So we need to think about intersectionality and how not just the intersectionality of the survivor, but also the perpetrator and how the systems is enabling the perpetrator in causing harm because of their identities and contexts as well. So now when we think about the culture of shame, as you asked, these are operating on different levels. So number one is the healing and restoration and the ethics of care part, which is again related to the just means and ends. So when we think of healing and restoration, we focus on how we do not just want, justice to be limited to rules and rights, and when we look at feminist literature, they often critique justice for limiting it to rules and rights, but we want to incorporate an ethics of care within the the process of justice as well. So when we speak of just means and ends, they speak about having the not just outcomes that are equitable and just, but also processes that are equitable and just. So we want to incorporate an ethics of care within the processes that are in place for seeking justice. Even something like speaking up about the harm that someone has faced can be quite re-traumatizing and quite re-victimizing for survivors, right? So we think of an ethics of care incorporating the idea of how to be trauma-informed and how to, be person-centered in the way that we're approaching this complaint process as well. How do we do it? For example, someone mentioned confidentiality. How do we do it in a way that maintains confidentiality? How do we do it in a way that addresses the power structures that exist within not just the organization, but at a larger structural level too? So we're incorporating an ethics of care within the outcomes and the procedures for seeking justice. At the same time, we have healing and restoration, which speaks about how justice is not limited to immediate redressal in the moment. Because survivors have spoken about how when we speak of immediate redressal, that doesn't really change the trauma that they have undergone. It doesn't change a lot of the consequences that they have to face because of violence. And so healing and restoration focuses on long-term change and healing for the survivors as well. So we speak about how, questioning, the trauma, like sitting with the trauma and seeking healing for the communities and the survivor. Now, this is occurring more on an individual level for the survivor. At the same time, we also integrate the transformation of systems thread into this at a more cultural and institutional level. So on an individual level, we're focusing on making the procedures more just and more caring. And we're speaking about long-term healing and restoration. At the same time, we're concurrently working to change our systems too and our culture too, to be able to make a culture that is more receptive of these kind of cases in a way that it isn't re-traumatizing for survivors, that encourages survivors to come up. So in transformation of systems, we also include the ecosystems of the survivor and the perpetrator, which is the employers in the workplace, the police that they may seek support from, families, friends. These are, things that can also stop a survivor from seeking support. So we're not limiting our approach of feminist justice to just the people, the stakeholders that were actually involved in the violence, but also across the communities and the ecosystems of the survivors and the perpetrator. And lastly, at the top of everything, at the heart of this feminist justice framework is the power-critical intersectional accountability. So when we speak of this, I think to address your second question, we speak of the participants within the study, and even through our research, we identified some ways to incorporate this power-critical intersectional accountability thread. Number one is through power audits, where within the justice redressal mechanism or within the implementation of the law, if we can do power audits to see where does the power lie, again, this is quite a complex process and it can look quite different for different organizations in different countries. But it is important to question where the power lies and who has the power to actually make decisions for the redressal process. Is it survivor-centric or is it only serving the needs of the organization? So that is one way to do it. Secondly, to center lived experience when we speak about justice as well. What ends up happening is that because justice is so, when we think of justice, we think of the law, and the law has a very universalist way of looking at things, like this is a list of things to do, this is how you redress the case, and all of that. But through our approach, we want to focus on lived experience and actually think about how is the context, the intersections of identity, the unique space where this violence occurred or was sustained is situated. And therefore, we think about lived experience and how the subjectivity of lived experience is at the center of each case, which is also again related to the ethics of care, because through ethics of care we talk about how we're not thinking of, we're also thinking of how we can have, subjective ways of addressing violence, so that care aspect is also related to intersectionality. And lastly, how can we think of the intersections, as I mentioned, of caste, disability, location, geographical location, designation of the person within the organization, to also incorporate an intersectional approach. I hope that's answered some of your questions. Thank you so much for the questions. They were lovely. Yeah, go ahead.
I think when we speak of cultural shift, be it in formal organizations or within supply chains or any sort of, even for informal workers, what we see is there's a culture of shame in terms of reporting, and there's a culture of shame in admitting that you've made a mistake, assuming that that maybe there are people who are capable of acknowledging that what they've done is wrong. But our systems or our laws do not give them this opportunity. Within the context of POSH, if I compare POSH with other laws around sexual violence in our country, POSH does have that scope where there is adequate opportunity for the person to sort of acknowledge that a mistake has been made, and then there is also the possibility of repair within that relationship. But what we see is the organization's reputation, and that's where the capitalist ideas come in, right? What happens when when a number of cases come out of an organization? That's why I think in our research we have also seen, and just other researches we have also seen, that even though a lot more organizations are complying with this law, a lot more organizations are reporting 0 cases. So they are complying, they are reporting 0 cases. They have to report, so they would rather report 0 cases than report the fact that they have X number of cases, because that's a huge reputational risk that they'll have to take. And which is also why a lot of cases will go unreported, a lot of cases will not make the media, and a lot of cases will not get any attention. When we think of supply chain, and I think that's where, when we were talking about the strategic opportunities, if you can go to that slide, we talked about organizing. Within supply chain, what we have seen in our experience, in our context, in our research, what we have seen is that they are informal workers, which means that they are not necessarily have the same entitlements or the protections when it comes to the employers or an employer-employee relationship. A lot of them are, especially in our context, I would say, a lot of them are women. A lot of them are working from home. And when you look at POSH law, and when you look at the definition of workplace, wherever you are working becomes your workplace for that duration. So within supply chain, there's a lot more factors that come into play, and that's where we think that the worker voice in organizing is a big opportunity, because we have seen trade unions coming up. We have seen the power that unionizing brings for workers, right? When they come together, when communities get organized, they're able to demand for better. I'm sure that some of you may have seen the recent, I think it was India-specific news, but I'm sure it's also sort of universal, where where workers had posted about their working conditions as Amazon workers. And we also know that unionization within Amazon is difficult. So you see that the organizations, that the employers are going to do whatever it takes to stop that organizing. And that's why we have listed it as a strategic opportunity, not just a gap, as an opportunity, because we feel that when this can happen, then protections can come in, not just for formal workers, but also for informal and any category of workers. Having said that, I do want to say that this study specifically was focused on formal urban workspaces in India, not necessarily informal workers or supply chain. But I wanted to add that input because it's something that we have seen in our work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asha. I also quickly, we have to go to the next part of the session, but we will hold space for more questions at the, yeah? Okay, okay, sure. I think someone else had a question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm not an expert on that topic, so please excuse my ignorance if there is too much of it. I work for GIZ in Bangladesh in the garment supply chains, and we do work with the so-called anti-harassment committees, somehow similar to the complaint committees. And we can confirm what you just said, that the committees are supposed to forward their protocols, their documentation to the Department of Labor, but they seldomly do that for that committee. The other committee, safety committee, etc., they do. So this reporting zero is very relevant for the producers. It's different if we work on how to sit tight, then suddenly everybody has a back problem for the first couple of months, and then you can work on that. But in this case, it's different. But I'm always struggling with the question, in this particular space of sexual harassment, are we not creating a narrative that is exaggerated and relieves the rest of the society of its burden? Because you were talking a lot about intersectionality, etc. But much money goes into these kind of projects that works with, let's say, workers that don't have a proper salary, that don't have a proper education, and it could stabilize the narrative that this is an issue that affects only that part of the society. While this particular thing is something that happens everywhere in the world, in all societal levels. So I would wonder, wouldn't it make sense whenever we engage in such a topic to always have a comparative group that is composed of us, managers, I don't know, office service people, etc. Because otherwise and maybe the empirical data is different, but I feel it's not only a problem of industrial supply chain based workplaces, it's a bigger problem.
I do agree that it's a bigger problem. I agree that sexual harassment or any kind of sexual violence occurs in every space, be it workplace, be it a family, any sort of institution, there is a possibility of such form of violence and harm occurring. The difference is, and if I am to bring in the POSH example itself, so according to this law, under this law, if an organization has more than 10 people employed full-time, they need to have an IC for reporting processes. If they don't, the team will be deferred to LC. So any cases that will come up will have to go to an LC, which is local committee, which needs to be formed at a district level. Now, we also spoke of funding challenges. And LC is governed by the state. It's in no way under the workplace or under the employer's control. So the protection or the opportunities for them to get access to redressal mechanism becomes difficult. And that's why when we speak of POSH or when we speak of sexual harassment at the workplace, this issue sort of gets magnified because we are comparing. Anvita and I, we work within an organization that has more than 10 people. We have a POSH policy, but for my domestic worker to report a case of sexual harassment, they need to figure out who the LC is. According to the law, this information also needs to be displayed very actively in public spaces. There's no information. There's no information on LC. There is no data on LC. And there is no LC. And when we speak of intersectionality, you'll see that the composition of these committees is also supposed to be intersectional. There are specific, I think, criteria mentioned that members from these communities can be a part of such a committee. But that does not translate into practice. So that's one. And I would also like to perhaps bring in the example of gig workers. The minute gig workers become employees, they will be entitled to certain protections under labor laws and labor codes, right, in India, and specifically to India. But they're not. So we know that problem exists in all different contexts, but the reason or perhaps the factors that influence the or that contribute to that problem are a little different. And that's why I also pointed it out that this study is specifically for formal urban workplaces in India, because we also recognize that there is such a vast difference in context. We cannot take this framework and expect informal workers or workers in the supply chain to just be like, okay, this works. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe this sort of core framework will remain the same, but how it gets translated into action will differ. Maybe the ethics of care in itself is very different for a formal worker versus an informal worker. And these are just hypothetical statements at the moment that I'm making, because the next step for us would be to just take this research ahead and see in what different kind of settings it can be applied. But right now, this was very specific to formal open workspaces. Having said that, I do agree that at all levels it needs to be addressed. But we also know through secondary research, that the higher you go, the more difficult it becomes to report. The more difficult it becomes for any sort of redressal process to take place. And we have that, we have so many cases in the news as evidence of this statement, right? So should we be the ones who should be talking about this, or sort of top-down approach is needed? That's also something to think about. Because when we speak of, and you very rightly pointed out, when we speak of supply chain, we sometimes get stuck in that sort of space of supply chain workers. But what about everybody else? I think it's a matter of the different factors that contribute to each of these spaces and how those can be addressed. But I do think that the framework sort of stays similar, if not the same, and then gets translated into different actions or different versions of it.
Yes, thank you so much. My name is Sapon. I'm working for GIZ in Cambodia. We have a project that promoting the sustainability in this supply chain in the garment sector. And in Cambodia, you can imagine 80% of the garment worker is female already. And gender-based violence and harassment is also one of, a kind of sector risk in the supply chain. And since I attended one session in this morning, we're talking about how can we engage the multi-stakeholder in the design and implementation of the grievance mechanism, particularly in the workplace. So I wondering if you, from your perspective or even from your research finding, is there any particular considerations or factor that the private sector, let's say the factory, should be considered when they design the grievance mechanism, given the fact that the nature of the GBV issue is completely different from other issue, right? In terms of, let's say, overtime payments, overtime or forced labor, for example, they can directly go to talk to the HR, talk to the trade union. But the GBVA is like the hidden issue. Sometimes they cannot really speak out. So I'm just wondering what would be the perspective from your research or from your experience, how can they consider about this issue into their design process? This is one question. And another question that I would like to get your perspective as well. What would be the role of private sector that could support in terms of prevention, in terms of addressing the GBV at the workplace? Thank you.
So thank you for that question. We'll be honest. We are also thinking about it. I think the first part of your question is more about the power critical aspect of it. In any sort of work setting, right, the power dynamics that come into play. Even in our experience, we have seen the people who are responsible to make sure that folks are, anybody within the team or anybody, in a workplace is able to report, get the quote unquote justice that they want and deserve. Sometimes they are also afraid what happens if the complaint is against somebody who, let's say if the complaint is against the employer. So that I feel like for that first question, the bringing in a lens of power critical in terms of designing and redesigning the grievance processes or grievance redressal processes would be very important. How do we know that the people who are involved in the redressal process are also safe from any form of retaliation? According to the law, they are, at least in the Indian context. But how much of that gets translated? Because within a setting like a workplace, be it any form of any sector, right? There's also a lot of other things. Withholding promotion, withholding pay, passive aggressive behavior, not being respectful, and any of this may not directly come under the definition of gender-based violence or sexual harassment, but it is a form of retaliation that might stem from the fact that, okay, you reported, or okay, you took it ahead and you took it seriously. So I think bringing in a power critical lens would be important.
Thank you so much, Arsha, and thank you for your question. I would just like to build on to what Arsha also said. I think when we speak of involving stakeholders within the grievance redressal process, I think it can be helpful to firstly think about who are the workers in the organization, right? What are the designations of the workers? There are going to be people at leadership positions. There are going to be people at manager positions. There's going to be people at program officer positions, and different depending on the workplace. What are the positions of the people? And then to have unique ways of involving each of the stakeholders in different ways. So even for example, the leadership of the organization may require a different kind of approach as compared to the other workers of the organization. So when we think of applying this feminist justice approach to within organizations, it's helpful to think about how it's going to be quite different for each organization and for each of the countries that you're also a part of. Now, how we can actually include all the stakeholders within the design process of the redressal mechanism is for number one, even starting off with a baseline survey or something, right, and seeing what is the awareness of the people in the organization about this kind of thing. Maybe they don't even understand the law. Maybe they aren't aware about the law. They don't understand the implications of the law or how the law is being implemented. So number one would just be to understand the awareness of the people in the workplace. Is there an IC that is the complaints committee or whatever the equivalent may be in your countries? Is that even being, is that even a part of the POSH process for your country? So those are things to consider. And after a baseline survey has been formed, then to think about how bespoke ways of addressing that for different stakeholders. So by maybe the leadership position can have a consultant who sort of helps them figure out how to make the redressal process more just. And for involving the rest of the organization, there could be a survey, or there could be, focus group discussions or something that are conducted with the entire organization to ask for their, inputs as well. And lastly, as Arsha mentioned, that perhaps people are scared about issues of confidentiality as well. So maybe they could have anonymous surveys or more anonymous ways of including their voices too. But those are some ways that more stakeholders can be involved in the grievance redressal process. And again, for leaders, it will look very different because leaders may also require training about the law. more extensively than workers, because they have to, like, even especially when we think of members of the complaints committee, the internal committee, they require, all of them are required to have training about the law, training about social justice and all of this, to be able to implement the law. So each of them will require training, awareness, baseline surveys to understand their current level of knowledge and their inputs, and then perhaps later more surveys or focus group discussions and such to be able to hear their voices.
Is it okay if we address the second question outside the room, perhaps? Because we are almost at time, and I know that somebody else also had a question. So maybe we'll take that last and then close the session.
Hello, my name is Mega Prunes. I work with UNFPA here in Bangkok. I have quite a provocative question, because you say that the focus is not on the company, is on the beneficiaries, but you call it workplace sexual harassment. But sexual harassment survivors working in workplaces aren't just exposed to sexual harassment in the workplace. And you talk about transformation of systems, and you talk about intersectional accountability. And my question is a little bit a follow-up. Shouldn't we be addressing sexual harassment and not just sexual harassment in the workplace from a company's perspective? And the reason why I also say this is because you were mentioning that one of the problems is that at the end of the year, we see companies reporting 0 cases of sexual harassment in realities where GBV prevalence is 40%, 50%. No one believes in that. But if they end up reporting 3 or 5 or 6 cases, they are considered poor companies. This also opens an opportunity for companies if they are addressing actually GBV, and not just GBV in the workplace, but addressing it via the workplace, so that when they report, it doesn't necessarily talk about them. Because at the end of the day, we are talking about the companies, and the focus is on the companies, and it's not on the GBV survivors. Just
So I don't disagree with that. I do think organizations all over the world should be addressing gender-based violence, given the scale of the problem we have, right? We talk about lack of resources, we talk about lack of funding, we talk about everything, and we agree that if every person or every sector, so to say, is to come together and address this problem, maybe we'll make a lot more gains. Within the workplace, so at least in our context, what we have seen is, we say that we work with different kind of organizations. There are some organizations who would want to do this only for a compliance point of view, but that's also a start, right? And that's how we see it. Should we not work with an organization who wants to do this training only from a compliance point of view? No, because every time, both of us are facilitators, both of us have facilitated multiple sessions. Every time we walk into a room, our hope is that at least one person will walk away with something. So that's one. And do organizations, I think that question is more of a macro level question. To what extent organizations in any sort of sector are responsible for addressing this problem that occurs on a day-to-day basis. Even with COVID-19, we saw that the understanding or the definition of workplace changed. And I'm genuinely not sure. I know that there were certain sort of in fact, this policy itself expanded the definition of the workplace, but I'm not sure to what extent organizations were able to actually address the violence that was happening. Because once again, taking the example of India, we saw that just as soon as the lockdown was initiated, cases of domestic violence were rising. Maybe I don't think I've looked at the data to say that those were all cases reported by working women. But to what extent organizations were addressing it, I'm genuinely not sure. Should they? Definitely. I think I would be the first person to say they should. It's just how things are at the moment.
Thank you so much, Aisha. Yeah, I'm going to quickly say this as well, just to build on what she said. I also want to say that when we were building the framework, we did keep gender-based violence as a whole in mind. But the reason we focus specifically on formal urban workplaces is because we want to make this feminist justice framework context-specific. And we identify the workplace as a stakeholder in this too. We identify employers and people within the organization as stakeholders in the justice process. Now, the reason why we're talking about workplaces specifically is that there are power dynamics that exist in the workplace, due to which currently there's a disproportionate power that people, like for example, people in leadership positions end up having as compared to people who may be reporting some of these cases, especially when the person in the leadership position is the person who has caused harm. And so when we built this framework, we wanted to think of workplaces, considering that workplaces have relational dynamics that are specific to the workplace. And these relational dynamics are obviously reflective of the larger dynamics within the world, right? Of this larger power structures. But they manifest in like those kind of like structural relations manifest differently in interpersonal relations in the workplace. So we wanted to keep that in mind, and we focused this specifically on workplaces, keeping that workplace relations can be, they have certain, professional sort of relations that can be specific to that workplace. But we do want to eventually think of how this kind of framework can be applied to gender-based violence at large, and that's a huge need when it comes to addressing violence as well. Lastly, going to just, okay. Lovely. Any other questions? We're at time now. Or perhaps we can, should we? Yeah, we'll. Next session is has to. But thank you so much. Thank you everyone so much for your time and for asking all of these lovely questions. That's also given us a lot to think about and take back to India as we work on our framework as well. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a lovely rest of the day.
So this